Paris, the glittering heart of Europe, the city of art, love, and revolution. But in the late 1600s, it wasn't romance that filled the air. It was fear. Behind the velvet curtains of aristocratic salons and the cobblestone alleys of the commoners, whispers spread of an invisible killer. People were dropping dead in their homes, sometimes entire families, and the cause wasn't war, famine, or plague. It was poison. And at the center of this storm was one woman, Catherine de Chaise, better known as La Voisin, the poisoner of Paris. She wasn't just another criminal. She was the shadowy figure behind a vast network of witches, midwives, priests, and fortune-tellers who supplied poisons, arranged black masses, and promised power, love, or freedom, for a price. To some, she was a savior. To others, she was the embodiment of evil. And in a city already haunted by political plots and royal scandals, she would become the most feared woman of her age. The Paris of Louis XIV, a dangerous paradise. To understand La Voisin, we must first understand the city she poisoned. Paris in the reign of Louis XIV was dazzling on the surface. The Sun King had transformed France into the most powerful nation in Europe. The nobility enjoyed grand banquets, glittering balls, and the luxury of Versailles. But beneath the gold and marble was corruption, jealousy, and desperation. Powerful aristocrats constantly schemed for influence at court. Ordinary citizens struggled under crushing taxes. And for women, especially widows and those trapped in loveless marriages, life was often brutal, with little escape. Poison became the weapon of the desperate. It was silent, invisible, and terrifyingly effective. No bloody daggers. No public assassinations. Just a powder slipped into wine, or a few drops in a cup of broth. A husband, an enemy, even a child could be gone within days. By the 1670s, Paris was gripped by rumors of a poison epidemic. Nobles feared drinking at banquets. Servants whispered about strange apothecaries in the city. And behind much of it, authorities would discover, was La Voisin. The rise of La Voisin. Catherine de Chaise was born in 1640 into a modest family. Little about her early years suggested the role she would play in history. But by her 20s, she had married a struggling jeweler named Antoine Monvoisin, and when his business failed, Catherine turned to fortune-telling to support her family. It started harmlessly enough. Palm readings. Love charms. Herbal remedies. In a city obsessed with astrology and superstition, such services were in high demand. But Catherine had an uncanny gift. She knew how to read people's fears and exploit them. Soon she was known as La Voisin, the neighbor, the woman you could go to when you had nowhere else to turn. Her reputation grew. Aristocrats visited her discreetly for love potions. Soldiers sought charms for luck. Desperate wives begged for help to conceive, or to rid themselves of unwanted pregnancies. And then came the darker requests. What if a woman wanted her abusive husband gone? What if a nobleman wanted to secure his inheritance? What if someone simply wanted revenge? La Voisin had an answer: poison. The business of death. La Voisin didn't work alone. She built a network of alchemists, priests, and women known as sorcières, witches, who could supply everything from aphrodisiacs to deadly toxins. Her clients included some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in France. The poisons themselves were terrifyingly effective. Arsenic mixed into wine. Mercury hidden in soups. Inheritance powders that killed slowly, making the death appear natural. Victims would suffer violent stomach pains, fevers, and eventual organ failure. Doctors of the time rarely suspected foul play. La Voisin also staged black masses for her clients. These ceremonies, whispered about in scandalous detail, involved defrocked priests, naked altars, and prayers to the devil. Nobles desperate for influence at court believed that through these rituals, combined with poison, they could clear away rivals or win the king's favor. Paris was becoming a city of secrets, where power, love, and survival could be purchased with a vial of powder from La Voisin. The affair of the poisons. In 1675, whispers of poison reached the highest levels of France. Too many nobles were dying mysteriously. Too many fortunes were changing hands. The rumors became impossible to ignore when it was alleged that even members of Louis XIV's court were involved. The scandal exploded when authorities arrested a midwife named Marie Bosse, who confessed that she and others had been selling poisons for years. She named names. And at the center of her accusations was La Voisin. The king ordered a secret tribunal, the Chambre Ardente, or Burning Court, to investigate. Over the next few years, hundreds of suspects were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Noble families were implicated. Priests were accused of performing satanic rituals. The scandal threatened to engulf the royal court itself. And yet, through it all, La Voisin continued to operate, protected by her connections and her reputation. Until finally, in 1679, her luck ran out. The arrest. On March 12, 1679, Voisin was arrested outside Notre Dame Cathedral, where she had gone to attend Mass. The irony was not lost on anyone, this woman who had trafficked in black masses, captured in a house of God. The news sent shockwaves through Paris. Who would she expose? Which noble families would be destroyed? Would the king himself be implicated? Voisin was taken to the Bastille. And as investigators began to peel back the layers of her empire, they realized the terrifying truth: she hadn't just supplied poison to a handful of desperate souls. She had built an underground empire of death that reached into the very heart of France. As Paris buzzed with rumors, the interrogation of Voisin began. Torture chambers filled with confessions. Secrets spilled like blood. And soon, the scandal would reach into the royal court itself, threatening not just nobles, but the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan. This was no longer just about a poisoner. It was about a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of the French monarchy. The aftermath of the arrest. When news broke of Voisin's arrest in March 1679, the city of Paris was electrified. This wasn't just the capture of another criminal. This was the fall of a woman who had, for years, become both feared and indispensable to the elite. Rumors swirled through the salons, the markets, and even the halls of Versailles. Who had gone to Voisin? Whose secrets would be revealed? The Chambre Ardente, the burning court established by Louis XIV to investigate the poison scandals, now had its star prisoner. The magistrates who presided over this court were sworn to secrecy, but leaks quickly reached the public. They revealed a story that was far darker and more widespread than anyone had dared imagine. The interrogations begin. At first, Voisin remained defiant. She denied involvement, scoffed at her accusers, and tried to present herself as a simple fortune teller whose reputation had been exaggerated. But the magistrates pressed her relentlessly. Witnesses were brought forward, former clients, associates, and rivals, each one eager to save themselves by naming her. Some of her assistants, desperate to avoid execution, described her workshops, shelves filled with potions, powders, and herbs. Others told of tiny glass vials of arsenic and mercury hidden in her home, labeled as inheritance powders. They spoke of women who had come to her, desperate to rid themselves of abusive husbands, and of nobles who demanded more, who sought power itself. But perhaps the most damning testimonies came from those who claimed to have seen her conduct black masses. The Black Mass Scandal. For the Parisian elite, the most shocking part of the scandal wasn't simply that Voisin sold poisons. It was that she was accused of orchestrating blasphemous rituals designed to summon the devil himself. Witnesses described a chilling scene: a defrocked priest standing over a naked woman lying on an altar, prayers recited backward, chalices filled with blood. Voisin, they claimed, would act as the intermediary, channeling these dark forces on behalf of her clients. Who were these clients? According to her accusers, many were members of the highest nobility, and some were very close to King Louis XIV himself. Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress. The name that shook Paris more than any other was that of Madame de Montespan, the reigning mistress of Louis XIV. For years, Montespan had been the most powerful woman in France, using her charm and intelligence to keep the king's love. But as she aged, her position became threatened by younger rivals. According to witnesses, she turned to Voisin to keep her hold over the king. The allegations were explosive. Montespan had supposedly commissioned love potions and participated in black masses to secure the king's affection. In one particularly scandalous account, during a ritual, prayers were offered that the king's heart would burn with passion for her forever. The possibility that the king's mistress, his closest companion, was tied to such witchcraft was a political earthquake. If true, it suggested that the monarchy itself had been touched by the poisoner's web. The king's dilemma. For Louis XIV, the affair of the poisons was a nightmare. On the one hand, he could not allow such crimes to continue unchecked. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people had been poisoned. His nobles were terrified. Justice had to be done. On the other hand, the investigation threatened to expose the inner scandals of his own court. If Madame de Montespan was truly guilty, it would destroy not only her reputation but also his own. So the king took a dangerous path. He allowed the Chambre Ardente to continue its investigations, but he placed strict limits on what could be revealed publicly. Confessions that implicated the highest nobility, especially Montespan, were quietly suppressed. In this way, the poison affair became not just a criminal case but a political chess game, balancing justice against the survival of the monarchy. The scope of the conspiracy. As interrogations continued, the sheer scale of the poison network was revealed. It wasn't just Voisin. There were dozens of fortune tellers, apothecaries, and midwives across Paris who sold poisons or charms. Many were women who lived on the margins of society, providing services that the church and the law refused to sanction: abortions, contraceptives, or love spells. But their trade in poison had grown into a shadow economy of death, fueled by the desperation of those who felt powerless in a rigid, patriarchal world. And Voisin was at the center, the spider in the web, coordinating and profiting from it all. The turning point. As the pressure mounted, Voisin's bravado began to crack. Under interrogation, she admitted to selling poisons and fortune-telling but denied involvement in the most serious accusations. She insisted she had never conducted black masses, and that the stories of satanic rituals were exaggerated. But the evidence was overwhelming. Too many witnesses. Too many confessions. The magistrates had all they needed to condemn her. Yet one question remained: how much would they reveal? The trial dragged on for months. More arrests were made. More nobles were implicated. The king, increasingly alarmed, ordered that some of the testimonies be sealed away, never to be made public. But for Voisin herself, there would be no escape. The sentence. In February 1680, after nearly a year of imprisonment and interrogation, Voisin was sentenced to death. The court found her guilty of witchcraft, heresy, and mass murder by poison. Her execution was set for February 22, and the people of Paris flocked to witness the fall of the woman who had haunted their nightmares. She was led to the Place de Grève, the city's main execution square, where a great pyre had been prepared. Voisin, dressed in a plain gown, climbed the scaffold with little resistance. Witnesses said she remained silent, refusing to confess or cry out. As the flames rose, the crowd erupted in both horror and fascination. The most feared woman in Paris was consumed by fire. But her death would not end the affair. Because though Voisin was gone, her trial had left behind a trail of secrets. Names had been whispered. Nobles had been implicated. And the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan, was still under suspicion. The question now was, could the monarchy survive the scandal? The execution echoes through Paris. On February 22, 1680, as the flames consumed Voisin in the Place de Grève, Paris let out a collective sigh of relief, or so it seemed. Crowds watched as the woman who had terrified the city for nearly a decade was reduced to ash. Yet, even as her screams faded into smoke, the terror she had spread did not vanish. For the people of Paris, Voisin's execution was both the end of a monster and the beginning of an even darker realization. If she was gone, what about her network? What about her clients? How many husbands, wives, and children had already been poisoned by those she supplied? And, most dangerously, how high had her influence reached? The affair of the poisons was far from over. In truth, Voisin's death was merely the opening act in a drama that now threatened the stability of the French monarchy itself. The whispers of the court. At Versailles, Louis XIV's magnificent palace glittered as always with music, dances, and intrigue. But beneath the surface, the court was suffocating under rumors. Names had been whispered during the investigations. Nobles had been accused of buying poisons or attending forbidden rites. The most explosive allegations, however, centered on one woman, Madame de Montespan, the king's powerful mistress. Montespan had been at the height of her influence when Voisin was active. For years, she had been the Sun King's companion, the mother of several of his children, and the undisputed queen of the royal court, even though she wasn't queen in title. But now, with Voisin dead, her name appeared again and again in secret testimonies. Witnesses alleged that Montespan had met with Voisin, purchased love potions, and even participated in black masses where prayers were offered to secure the king's undying love. For Louis XIV, this was nothing short of a catastrophe. The king's fear. Louis XIV had built his reign on the image of absolute power. He was the Sun King, the center of France, untouchable, uncorrupted. But if the public believed his mistress had used sorcery and poison to manipulate him, it would shatter that image. So the king made a fateful decision: he would continue the investigations into poisoners but suppress any evidence that tied his court too closely to the scandal. When Montespan's name appeared in the records, the documents were quietly sealed. When witnesses gave damning testimony, they were hushed, imprisoned, or ignored. The king refused to allow her to be interrogated directly. This wasn't justice, it was damage control. The Chambre Ardente continues. Meanwhile, the Chambre Ardente pressed on. Dozens of accused poisoners, fortune-tellers, and conspirators faced trial. Some were tortured until they confessed to crimes they may or may not have committed. Many were executed, burned at the stake, hanged, or sent to prison for life. The trials revealed shocking details about Parisian society. Wives confessed to poisoning abusive husbands. Servants admitted to murdering masters who mistreated them. Nobles revealed their willingness to dabble in poison or sorcery to climb the social ladder. It was as if the city itself had been unmasked, showing a face of desperation, cruelty, and corruption. The fate of Montespan. Though Louis XIV shielded her from official accusation, Madame de Montespan could not escape the shadow of suspicion. The gossip was relentless. Her rivals at court whispered behind her back, and pamphlets circulated in Paris mocking her supposed involvement in witchcraft. The king, increasingly uncomfortable with the scandal, began to distance himself from her. By the early 1680s, Montespan's influence had waned. She eventually fell from grace, replaced in the king's affections by younger women, including the quiet and devout Madame de Maintenon. Montespan lived out the rest of her life in relative obscurity, her name forever tied to the affair of the poisons. Whether she truly participated in black masses remains a mystery, but the accusations alone were enough to tarnish her legacy. A city of fear. For the ordinary people of Paris, the scandal only deepened their unease. Every sudden death, every unexplained illness, was now seen as a possible poisoning. Apothecaries were eyed with suspicion. Servants feared being accused of foul play. And for women, especially widows and healers, the risks were immense. The witch hunts of earlier centuries had returned in a new form. Women who dabbled in herbal medicine or fortune-telling were now lumped together as possible poisoners. The line between superstition, medicine, and crime blurred. The city lived under a shadow, unsure of who to trust. The king's silence. By 1682, Louis XIV had had enough. The Chamber Ardente had convicted over 300 people, with many executed, but the scandal threatened to consume his reign. The king abruptly ordered the tribunal dissolved. Many records of the investigations were sealed or destroyed. The official story was that the poison epidemic had been rooted out, that the guilty had been punished, and that Paris was once again safe. But those who knew the truth understood differently. The records that remained revealed that many noble names had been protected, and many crimes left unpunished. Voisin had died, but her shadow lingered. Because the legacy of the poisoner of Paris was not simply her crimes, it was the paranoia, the suspicion, and the dangerous precedent it set. In the final chapter, we will explore how Voisin's trial reshaped Paris, the monarchy, and Europe's fear of poison and witchcraft. And we will ask, was she truly the villain, or a symptom of a society poisoned long before her? The trial, execution, and legacy of the poisoner of Paris. As whispers of poisoning turned into open fear, the authorities could no longer ignore the epidemic sweeping Paris. The death toll was climbing, and suspicions pointed to a shadowy network of poison sellers. At the center of it all was Catherine de Chaise, better known as Voisin. The arrest of Voisin. In March 1679, Voisin was finally arrested outside the Church of Notre Dame, where she had just attended Massachusetts. The irony was striking. The woman accused of profiting from death and blasphemy had sought forgiveness at the very altar of God. Soldiers surrounded her carriage, and she was taken into custody. Her arrest was the beginning of what would later be called the Affair of the Poisons, a scandal that reached into the highest ranks of French society, even threatening to expose members of King Louis XIV's court. The shocking confessions. Under interrogation, Voisin denied many of the accusations. Yet her home told a different story. When investigators searched it, they uncovered jars of strange powders, herbs, and potions, as well as notes from wealthy clients. Witnesses described black masses, where infants were rumored to have been sacrificed, though historians debate how much of this was truth and how much hysteria. One thing was certain, Voisin had sold poisons to many, including noblewomen desperate to rid themselves of unwanted husbands. The scandal reached Madame de Montespan, the king's own mistress, who was accused of using Voisin's services to keep Louis XIV's love and perhaps to remove rivals. Though Montespan was never convicted, her reputation was permanently stained. The Trial of Terror. Voisin's trial captivated Paris. Crowds gathered outside the court, eager to hear each sordid detail. The judges pressed her on names of clients, and though she refused to betray some, enough evidence surfaced to convict her. The courtroom was filled with gasps when nobles' names were read aloud. It became clear that poison had become the silent weapon of the elite, a tool of power struggles, broken hearts, and greed. Voisin, however, was unrepentant. She remained defiant, sometimes mocking her interrogators. Yet when the death sentence was passed, even she must have felt the weight of her actions. The execution. On February 22, 1680, Voisin was led to the Place de Grève in Paris. The crowd was massive, people wanted to see the downfall of the woman who had terrified their city. She was burned alive at the stake, her screams mixing with the roar of flames and the murmurs of the crowd. Her death was meant to be a warning, but it was also a spectacle. Some in the crowd felt justice had been served, others whispered that many more guilty still walked free. The aftermath and legacy. The affair of the poisons continued long after La Voisin's death. Hundreds were investigated, and dozens executed. But the scandal revealed something deeper. Beneath the glittering surface of Louis XIV's court lay fear, corruption, and desperation. For the people of Paris, La Voisin became a symbol of the dangers lurking in the shadows. She was remembered not just as a poisoner, but as the face of an era when death could be bought with a few coins and secrecy was as valuable as gold. Her story has endured through centuries because it represents the clash between power, superstition, and justice. She was one woman who, through cunning and cruelty, terrorized an entire city, and whose downfall shook the very foundations of France's golden age.